Walt Disney, the creator of magical worlds from enchanted forests to fantastic tales of animals. Walt Disney himself produced 14 classic movies, including Mary Poppins, Alice in Wonderland, Cinderella, and 101 Dalmatians. But the one that started it all was Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, released in 1937. Walt Disney Studios started in 1923 in a very small apartment-type building where the rent was only $10 a month. For 14 years, Disney had been involved in numerous productions, including some of the well-known characters we all know today: Mickey Mouse, Minnie Mouse, Donald Duck, the Three Pigs, and Dippy Dog, who later became Goofy. All of these characters were in shorts, such as the band concert and Steamboat Willie, running from 6 to 8 minutes each. Steamboat Willie used special synchronized soundtracks to establish character and to add comic relief. Color was added to Disney cartoons soon after in 1935. Walt adding color to the background as well as to the characters was a huge advancement to the animation world. When Disney presented the idea of a full-length cartoon feature which would entirely be in color, there were many skeptics, those of which included his brother Roy and his wife Lillian, stating the fact that it would be very costly and many people wouldn't want to sit through an 83-minute film. But Disney was determined, and he set out to find a story that he could sink his teeth into. For some time, he considered Bambi, but he decided that he wanted a different story for his first movie. After countless meetings and debating, he chose the Brothers Grimm story of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. The problem was, the Brothers Grimm version was less than child-friendly and had the task of rearranging the details to create a magical, G-rated story. Disney and his animation team then began to create the full-length motion picture that would change the animation world for good. He spent countless weeks scratching out details, memorizing the story, and working out details down to what he imagined the voices to be. He used plays of Snow White that he had seen between 1913 and 1917 as references for the message that he wanted to portray. Walt called a series of meetings to consult with his animators and investors, where he acted out the entire story, utilizing the tiniest of details to fully portray it to his audience. Intrigued and enchanted, anyone who watched his presentation was immediately on board. The company began on the project as soon as they could, using ideas Walt gave them to get a storyline in place. The first scene they worked on was towards the middle, when Snow White meets the dwarves. Disney became quite obsessive over the details, wanting everything to be perfect, from the color palette to the names of the dwarves. Some of the names considered for the dwarves were Scrappy, Dirty, Daffy, Nifty, Burpy, Lazy, and Dizzy. After hours of thought and countless changes, the final dwarves became Happy, Dopey, Sneezy, Grumpy, Doc, Sleepy, and Bashful. Each of the dwarves had their own details, including beards, hats, shoes, and shirts. Disney made sure that his animators stuck to earth tones because he thought that bright colors would be too much for the audience. It was estimated that the film could be produced for a budget of $250,000, which was 10 times the amount an average short costed. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs eventually ran up a total cost of $1,488,422.74, which was a massive sum for a feature film in the 1930s. Mr. Disney even had to mortgage his house to help finance the film's production. The songs in Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs were composed by Frank Churchill and Larry Morey. Because Disney did not have its own music publishing company at the time, the publishing rights for the music and songs were administered through Bourne Company Music Publishers, which continues to hold these rights. In later years, the studio was able to acquire back the rights to the music from many of the other films, but not Snow White. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs became the first American film to have a soundtrack album, which was released at the same time as the feature film. Prior to Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, a movie soundtrack recording was unheard of and of little value to a movie studio. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs premiered at the Carthay Circle Theater on December 21, 1937, followed by a nationwide release on February 4, 1938. The full-length feature film was a huge success for the Disney Company, and the film received a standing ovation from a star-studded audience, which included celebrities such as Charlie Chaplin, Judy Garland, and Ed Sullivan. The film appeared on the cover of Time magazine 6 days after the release. It went on to become a major box office success, making 4 times more money than any other motion picture released in 1938. By the end of its original run, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs had earned $7,846,000 in international box office receipts. Due to the success of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, Disney was able to afford a bigger lot in Burbank for a new studio. In 1940, construction was completed on the Burbank studio, and Disney's staff swelled to over 1,000 artists, animators, storymen, and technicians. The studio lot was subsequently expanded during the 1950s to include sound stages and production craft facilities for the live-action movies and television shows that were being produced. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs first re-released in 1944 in order to raise a revenue for the Disney studio during the World War II period. This re-release set a tradition of re-releasing Disney animated features every 7 to 10 years, and Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs was re-released to theaters in 1952, 1958, 1967, 1975, 1983, 1987, and 1993. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs has had a lifetime gross of $416 million across its original release and several reissues. The film still registers as one of the top 10 American film moneymakers of all time. The success of Disney's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs influenced other animation studios over the years to begin producing their own full-length cartoon films. Over the course of just 2 decades, Disney revolutionized the entertainment industry. The history of animation is very long and complicated, with many different advancements over the years. Walt Disney was a huge part of the animation advancements in the 1900s. He made firsts for many different concepts. The Walt Disney Company has made and produced over 50 different feature cartoon films in the past 75 years. With each movie, technology has been getting better and better. Even today, the Walt Disney Company is re-releasing films that are above and beyond, and other animation studios can't even come close to being compared with them. Not only did Disney change the animation world, but he also began to change the amusement park world as well. One day, Walt Disney had a vision. It was a vision of a place where children and parents could have fun together. The more Walt dreamed of a magical park, the more imaginative and elaborate it became. The original plans for Disneyland was to build the park on 8 acres next to the Burbank studios, where his employees and their families could go to relax. World War II soon put those plans on hold. During the war, Walt had time to come up with new ideas and creations for his magical park. It was soon clear to him that 8 acres would not be enough. Location was top priority. The property would have to be within the Los Angeles metropolitan area and accessible by freeway. The search for the best spot finally ended in the rural Anaheim, California, with a purchase of 160 acres of orange groves near the junction of the Santa Ana Freeway and Harbor Boulevard. Even though Disneyland was very expensive, Walt once said, "I could never convince the financiers that Disneyland was feasible because dreams offer too little collateral." Walt then turned to television for his financial support. Walt Disney's Disneyland, a television series, offered a glimpse of the future park project. This brought the idea of Disneyland into reality for Walt and the American people. Construction for Disneyland began in July 1954, just 12 months before the park was scheduled to open. That day was the day Walt Disney's life would never be the same. When the real designing for the park came around, Walt was met with tough questions. How would you make believable wild animals that aren't real? How do you make a Mississippi paddle ship? How do you go about building a huge castle in the middle of Anaheim, California? Walt Disney then looked to his movie studio staff for the answers. The design of Disneyland was something never done before. There would be 5 different unique lands. These lands would be known as Main Street USA, Adventureland, Frontierland, Tomorrowland, and Fantasyland. Walt stayed close to the park's construction and would constantly be involved in every little detail. He'd visit the construction site at least once a week, and the project made progress despite some of the huge obstacles they had to overcome. Slowly but surely, Disneyland was ready for opening day. Everything seemed to come together. The magical little park Walt had dreamed of was really a $17 million magic kingdom. Walt's dream had come true, and Disneyland was ready to open. Some of the attractions included scenes and features from Disney's classic animated movies, some of which included Peter Pan, Mr. Toad's Wild Ride, Dumbo, and Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Opening day was a day that would go down in history. 6,000 invitations to the grand opening had been mailed, but by mid-afternoon, over 28,000 ticket holders were storming the Disneyland gates. Most of the tickets were counterfeit. While standing in Town Square, Walt could look around and see the fulfillment of his hopes and dreams in the form of a spectacular entertainment kingdom. But opening day was a terrible disaster. A California heat wave raised temperatures up to 110 degrees Fahrenheit. The asphalt was still steaming because it had been laid the night before, and it literally trapped high-heeled shoes. After the opening day, the heat wave continued and almost wiped out the park. Despite the terrible opening day conditions, the park did eventually pick up. By 1965, 10 years after opening day, 50 million visitors had come through the gates. 57 years later, Disneyland became much more than anyone could have ever expected. Over the years, attractions such as Haunted Mansion, Space Mountain, Big Thunder Mountain, Indiana Jones, It's a Small World, and the Matterhorn, to name a few, have been added to Disneyland. To this day, Disneyland is not yet complete. New concepts are being added to the park every day. If Walt Disney were alive today, he may even be shocked by the success of his little fantasy park in Anaheim. Even though Walt Disney wasn't able to see how his park and his company prospered and grew into the 21st century, his legacy still lives on with us. Throughout Disneyland and throughout the entire world, he will always be there. He has set the ground standards for many other entertainment companies in the world. Before Walt Disney, there was no plot to little animated cartoons. There was no sound, and there was no meaning. Because of Mr. Disney, our world is filled with much more magic and laughter. As Walt Disney said, "I only hope that we don't lose sight of one thing, that it was all started by a mouse."